Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. So my name is Sean Gonsalves. I am a senior reporter and editor and the communications person for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance Community Broadband Networks Initiative. It's a mouthful, but I'm on the community broadband networks side of things at our organization. We track for the past 16 years the birth and development of community broadband networks across the country. And we are heavily involved in the broadband policy space. Our website, communitynets.org, is sort of a news website or Amazon, if you will, of broadband information. And so I invite you all to check that out at your convenience. So today, this next slide here will show what we'll be covering here in this particular portion. And I think this is a good starting point because, these are really exciting times for broadband. I mean, there's so many troubling issues in the world with so much division, but the need for everyone to have access to high-speed internet is one of the most bipartisan issues out there, especially as you get closer to the local level. So today, on what we're going to cover are these some of these things that I have in the bullet points here. So the first thing we're going to look at is what the scope of the divide looks like in Appalachia. Try to quantify the numbers here in terms of who needs to be reached with this infrastructure in particular, and then also some all of the digital equity work that needs to happen simultaneous to that. The other thing that we'll cover briefly is we hear these terms unserved and underserved. What does that mean? I'm going to briefly explain that. And then we'll get into the funding landscape, the general sort of how and who's going to pay for resolving this issue, and where and what's really driving the policies and the moment that we find ourselves in. And then I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between the federal government and the funding sources and the various state broadband offices who will be overseeing each state's efforts in what is being called the Internet for All initiative. And then lastly, I'll close with giving you a few examples of what some of the states in the Appalachia region are doing, just to give you a sense of some of the variety that we're seeing across the nation. So we can go ahead and get into the next slide. And let's talk just for a moment, because you'll hear the words unserved and underserved all the time. And so everyone needs to know what that means and, of course, why that matters. And so without getting into all of the sort of the technical details, unserved are addresses or locations, whether they be households, businesses, community anchor institutions that do not have access to high-speed internet because the infrastructure simply isn't there. And then underserved refers to locations, addresses, household, businesses, community anchor institutions and the like, who have some service, but it's really not adequate in terms of, universal connectivity, or in some instances, not adequate in terms of the kind of connectivity speeds that are being delivered. And as it relates to unserved and underserved, the most important thing within the context of funding is that in the infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, it defines, it says that unserved locations are the first priority of funding. In terms of what the states are going to be focused on as the first priority. And then underserved refers to areas that will be sort of the second priority. Now, depending on the state and the amount that they have, various states have various opinions as to whether or not the funding is adequate to take care of all of the unserved. And then with I guess you could say, the leftover money, as it were, we'll focus in more on the underserved areas. And so on this next slide is where we can get into a bit about quantifying. What are we talking about, the scope of this? And so this slide here is based on the FCC data. which most people in this, well, there's near universal agreement that the FCC data isn't as precise as we would like it to be, but this is the best data available. And it's certainly what is driving the funding amounts and mapping and targeting where these funds should be directed. And so here we look at a breakdown of each of the 12 states in the Appalachia region, and we're looking at the number of unserved locations just within the Appalachia regions of each of these 12 states. And again, unserved meaning the numbers of locations that do not have access to broadband. And it's important to note on this slide that when we say the number of unserved, we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about households. We're talking about businesses. We're talking about, in some instances, multi-dwelling units, apartment buildings. So these are not individuals. These are, think of these in terms of households and businesses, and in some cases, apartment buildings or dwellings that have, more than one unit with residents living in each. So as you can see here, West Virginia, of all of the states in Appalachia, have the highest number of unserved locations, 271,000. In the next slide, we will add in the number of underserved locations. And as you can see here, we've got, again, just to remind you, these are locations and addresses, not individuals, but you get a sense of the size and the scope here. Once again, I think, yes, West Virginia, Georgia actually, and Ohio have the highest number of underserved locations in the Appalachia region of those states. In the next slide here, it gives you a sense of the percentage of locations that are unserved. Now, the first thing to note, I think here, is that the majority of locations in Appalachia are considered to be served, even though everyone agrees that the data is flawed. Still, it's the best data we have. And so this particular slide here is meant to show the percentage of unserved locations in each state that are in the Appalachia region. And you can kind of see the variety. Once again, West Virginia has the largest proportion of unserved locations of any of the 12 states in the Appalachia region. The next slide here gives us a different way of looking at it. Given that the priority it will be on unserved locations, this map here shows how much of a priority Appalachia regions will be within each state. And the good news, particularly for West Virginia, is 100% of the unserved locations in West Virginia are in the Appalachia region. So in West Virginia in particular, that is going to be the primary area of focus in terms of funding. Now, on this next slide here, this is that shows the BEAD allocations. This is the big bucket of funds in the Infrastructure Act devoted to building infrastructure, the physical networks in the Appalachia region. And each state, the infrastructure law was written where each state got a minimum of 100 million, and then the extra money they got was based on a formula that, I'm oversimplifying, but is basically based on the number of unserved and underserved locations in each state, with some, high cost location for stuff mixed in as well. And so that's why you see the varying amounts. And so states that obviously that have the higher number of unserved and underserved locations will get a bigger a BEAD allocation. So we can see some of these amounts. We've got Pennsylvania and West Virginia getting 1.2 billion. Kentucky's going to be getting 1.1 billion, Georgia 1.3 billion, and so on and so forth. And so this gives you, overall, these slides give you a sense of the scope and the locations that the infrastructure law and what the state grant programs are particularly focused on in terms of funding building out infrastructure in areas where it does not exist or where the infrastructure is not adequate. Yes, and if there's questions, please drop them as I go along. If there's a word that I'm using that is unfamiliar or a concept that's making you scratch your head, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. This map here is a heat map, and this is really to show you sort of the concentration across Appalachia of where the unserved locations are and where the underserved locations are. So you can see the orange regions are the unserved locations where those will be priority areas where they'll look to build new networks in those orange regions in particular. By contrast, of course, the blue regions, and some people have accused me of being colorblind, so if that's not blue to you, then I apologize. But it's a sort of a shade of blue in my eyes. Those are the areas that are considered to be served. And then you can see if I don't know if the screen's big enough, but there's different splotches of yellow areas, and those are the underserved locations in the Appalachia region. Now we can get into the general funding landscape. And now that we have a sense of the size and scope of the divide, and have quantified that, we can look at where is the money coming from. The bulk of what states are spending on broadband is coming from the federal government. And there are different buckets of funds. And with each bucket of funds, there are slightly different spending rules that are associated with each. Now, in years past, some states have had broadband offices. Most states didn't. They're setting up broadband offices or have set up, but they're in their infant stages of standing up those offices. But in years past, whether you had a broadband office or not, many states have used state dollars to fund broadband projects in years past, or relied almost exclusively on the private market making investment decisions in terms of where infrastructure should be funded and service should be available. And now that state broadband offices have been established, they've been established essentially to manage these federal funds in what are called competitive state grant programs. So there'll be a competition, there's scoring rubrics to decide which projects will get what funding and how much. The next slide, we get into a bit about some of the money that's already been allocated and is out there. So sort of the first large tranche of funding that states and localities received was money from the American Rescue Plan Act. Now, even within the American Rescue Plan Act, there were sort of different buckets of funds and what you could spend it on. And so part of the American Rescue Plan Act included $350 billion that they refer to as the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. And there were an array of infrastructure projects that states or communities could use that money towards, which included things like water and sewer, but you could also use it for broadband projects. There was a separate, with the American Rescue Plan Act, there was a separate bucket of funds known as the Capital Projects Fund. That was a dedicated fund of $10 billion specifically for broadband infrastructure projects. That first bucket of money in the American Rescue Plan Act, some went to states, some went directly to localities. With the CPF funds, the Capital Projects Funds, these are funds that were awarded to states. And in, I think, every state, though, that bucket of money went into whatever existing broadband programs the state was administering. And I should point out that a lot of states and localities didn't really realize this out the gate, and may have recognized this a bit too late in terms of making funding decisions or how they were going to spend their rescue plan money. But it turns out that the spending rules with the rescue plan funding as it relates to broadband are much more flexible. So, for example, in the infrastructure bill, when they talk about unserved and underserved, they define unserved by speed alone, essentially, and underserved by speed alone. With the rescue plan funding, there was a little bit more of a broader definition of how you could define unserved and underserved. You could take into account things like reliability and affordability. Those kind of metrics are not a part of the BEAD allocations. And so the rescue plan money is where you have the most flexibility. Then in this next slide, this was an ongoing program. The Agriculture Department, USDA, has the Reconnect program, which is specifically for eligible rural communities. And it's both a loan and a grant program to build broadband networks in eligible or rural areas. And eligible applicants include private internet service providers, states, local governments, but also electric and telephone cooperatives and tribes as well. And as I said, it's both a loan and grant program. So that means that that applicants can apply for like 100% grant, or they can apply for 100% loan at favorable rates, or they can do a combo of a 50-50, 50% grant, 50% loan. And with each project, there is a $25 million max amount per project. This is an ongoing program that existed prior to the infrastructure bill, although when they passed the infrastructure bill, there were some funds from the infrastructure bill that were dumped into this Reconnect program. The next slide here, this has already occurred, but just to give you a sense of the funding landscape, the RDOF fund, which is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, this was a reverse auction. This is a FCC program where they budgeted for $20.4 billion. And essentially the way it worked was that private providers and electric cooperatives could bid on project areas in rural communities. There's been issues with the program, including a number of the ISPs who were awarded bids ended up defaulting and lost the award. And so, of course, in those areas, it's not exactly clear what will happen with those projects, but it matters, of course, because in areas that are defaulted, there's folks who are chomping at the bit to get this kind of infrastructure in place, and in certain areas under RDOF that won't happen. So far, of the $20.4 billion that was allocated for RDOF, $6.4 billion have been awarded and allocated. And so there's a real question, though, right now as to what the FCC will do with the remaining $14 billion that's currently sitting in the RDOF fund. And this map here is from the Cooperative Network Services, but it just will give you a sense of what rural areas in the country have been targeted by these RDOF grants. And as it relates to sort of the interaction between BEAD and RDOF, it basically varies from state to state. There are some states who say, if it's an RDOF area, we won't use BEAD funds because we don't want to duplicate. Other states are saying, well, RDOF might not do the trick, and so we may look to supplement some of those areas with BEAD funds. Now, the next slide, we get into kind of the meaning of the moment and what is driving all of what the states are doing in terms of their strategy and structures and some of the rules around spending rules around investment. So as many of you are familiar with, I believe it was November of 2021 when the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed. It represents, among other things, the single largest federal investment in broadband in United States history. And so you hear lots of folks, including myself, say that this is very much akin to rural electrification, the national effort to bring electricity to rural America about a century ago. In the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $65 billion was set aside to fund broadband expansion in all 50 states and U.S. territories. The biggest bucket of funds in all of this funding is the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And these are funds to build physical networks. As I mentioned earlier, each state gets 100 million plus the additional amount based on the number of unserved and underserved locations in each state. So this is the big bucket of funds here. And the good news, especially for the Appalachia region, is that the way the BEAD was designed and the way the law was written and it was intended to focus most of the infrastructure dollars to go to rural areas that lack the infrastructure to deliver high-speed internet access. And so this next slide will give us a bit of a sense of where we are in the process. So initially, in order to participate in this program, every state had to submit a letter of intent. Every state in U.S. territory has done that. That means everybody's on board with the BEAD program. That's in the rearview mirror. Now, in order to unlock those BEAD funds, the infrastructure law required that states submit certain documents and answer certain questions that really explain in detail how each state envisions spending this money in compliance with the infrastructure law. And so the first part of it is that each state had to develop a 5-year action plan. And most states, it's a pretty extensive document. In some states, it runs, several hundred pages. In other states, it's dozens of pages. But it's essentially an outline and a description of the digital landscape in each state and how the state is currently thinking about what the challenges are in terms of getting broadband to everyone, and how the state plans to approach how they'll spend the BEAD dollars and where they'll focus, et cetera. Almost every state, and maybe now every state, has their 5-year action plan in. And the NTIA website, NTIA is part of the Treasury Department. What is it? The National Telecommunication Information Agency or something to that, but they are administering the BEAD program. They're the ones who are in charge of these funds. And one of the reasons why they were given that authority is because Congress felt that the FCC in the past hadn't done such a great job, particularly with RDOF, and thought that the federal dollars would be better spent by allowing the states to make decisions as to where these funds should be spent. So after the 5-year action plan, the law requires, there it is, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, not agency. Thank you, Yokai. So most states have got their 5-year action plan in, which is a requirement to get the funds. And then another requirement is this thing that they call the initial proposal. And in the initial proposal is a more detailed document that not only includes the information that's in the 5-year action plan, but also lays out how the states are going to do their challenge process. And without getting into the weeds and the technical aspects of it, the challenge process is really about internet service providers and states and localities trying to get a more refined sense of what will be considered unserved versus underserved, and kind of getting that map a bit more precise and accurate. Once the NTIA approves the initial proposal, that is what unlocks up to 20% of each state's BEAD allocation. Then there's the challenge process. Now, the only state, the state that's furthest along in this is Louisiana. Louisiana right now, I believe, just opened their challenge process. They've already had their 5-year action plan approved. They've got their initial proposal approved by NTIA. Now they are in the challenge process. And then that leads to the last bit, which is that unlocks the rest of the funds, which is the sign off from NTIA on the final proposal, which includes everything that I just mentioned, plus a description of the various projects that the state is eyeing, and how they plan to award and what the rules are around awarding those funds to individual projects. Now, where we are right now, most states are in the process of submitting their initial proposal. The way the timeline works is basically every state needs to have their initial proposal to the NTIA by basically the end of December of this year. So it gives you a sense of when the money is going to be coming and when you might start seeing projects being funded. Now, in the next slide, this is all infrastructure stuff. Now, in the next slide, this is another very important aspect of the infrastructure bill, which is, you've heard this phrase, if you build it, they will come. Well, when it comes to broadband, yes and no. There's other barriers to broadband adoption or folks getting online than just whether or not the physical network or service exists in their area. There's any number of challenges. At the top of that list, of course, is affordability. But then there are, millions of Americans who need some digital literacy training, who need to feel comfortable in using these technologies and being able to navigate their way online. Some households have issues with, even if they can afford the service, there's device access issues and how all of that stuff fits together. There's enrolling people in, as Ms. Manchin mentioned earlier, the Affordable Connectivity Program. So all of these things are meant to work hand in glove. The money, the BEAD dollars for the physical infrastructure, and the Digital Equity Act, which is funding specifically for digital equity initiatives, sort of all of the non-infrastructure funding around broadband to increase broadband adoption. In the Digital Equity Act, it was $2.75 billion, and that is to fund 3 different programs. The first of which is the State Digital Equity Planning Grant. That was $60 million, which states have already received based on a formula. NTIA is at their site. You can go there to find out how much, your state or each state has received. And this is for these were the funds for states to begin the planning that they need, because the Digital Equity Act, like the BEAD, requires that each state put together a digital equity plan. NTIA and the federal government were encouraging states to kind of do those things simultaneously. One state like Maine combined their 5-year plan with their digital equity plan in one document. Most states are doing their 5-year action plan on BEAD separate from their digital equity plan, but still all of this stuff is meant to work in tandem. And so the State Digital Equity Planning Grant was funds to help states put together those plans. The Digital Equity Capacity Building Grant, that's $1.4 billion, and that will be split among the states as well. And that is really to sort of beef up the capacity to implement the state's digital equity plans. And then that third program, the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program, the $1.25 billion is meant to support the actual programs on the ground. Once the plan is in place, once things get executed, there's going to be need to be some funding to sustain those programs moving forward. And I'd like to say that the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which is one of our allies in this work, they are a treasure trove of information on all things digital equity. This next slide, which they were actually NDIA shared with us, is the sort of the estimated timeline for the Digital Equity Act funds. So as I mentioned, the planning funds, we're past that. The states have got their planning funds in place to help them develop their digital equity plans. And then by the spring of 2024, is when the NTIA is going to open up that second program, those capacity grants. So we're not quite there yet. We're still in the phase of each state developing their digital equity plans and getting those signed off on. The capacity grants are coming up next. That's expected to open up in the spring. And then states will start to receive those dollars next summer, early fall. And then that will unlock the third program, which is the competitive grants that the states will be allocating to individual organizations and localities and such to implement these digital equity plans at the local level. And the NTIA will open that process up in around the fall of 2024, so that by the winter of 2024, the beginning of 2025 is probably when local organizations will begin to see some of those digital equity program dollars coming in. Now, the next slide here, and this is something else that Ms. Manchin put on, but this is also a super important component to what was also passed in the infrastructure bill, the Affordable Connectivity Program. This is a program that essentially subsidizes monthly internet bills for eligible low-income households, essentially, households that are on the free and reduced lunch programs. I think that meets the criteria for the federal guidelines, poverty guidelines. And so that program was established with a $14.2 billion fund. And again, $30 a month. Now, in some areas, there are low-cost plans where $30 a month pays for just about the whole bill or the whole bill. But in other areas where where the lowest tier plan may be a little bit more than that, it's still a significant benefit. And on tribal lands, it's a $75 per month stipend. And also, as part of this program, there is a one-time $100 subsidy for internet-connected devices. So the ACP is an extremely important program. However, next slide. It doesn't have an infinite amount of funds in it. As I mentioned, there's $14.2 billion that's been put in this program. Now, we built this dashboard, which is the slide, which is part that you see on the right, that what I think is a pretty beautiful looking graphic there. You see the United States there and what have you. And we built that because we were trying to figure out at current, and this is an iterative thing. So every 2 weeks, this is updated with numbers from USAC, where these dollars come from. And it's meant to track state by state down to the zip code level. There's a congressional district overlay in this map, and it's meant to track how many households are enrolled. But one of the questions we were looking to answer is, when will this fund run out? And now everyone is now aware that the ACP right now is on track at current funding rates. There's 52 million eligible households. There's about 20 million enrolled in the program. We're talking about a $600 million a month burn rate. And right now that fund is scheduled to be depleted about April of next year. It's a major concern. And so time is running out. There are a number of efforts underway, advocacy to save this program. In Congress now, nothing has been formally introduced to replenish this fund as of yet. There's talk of, a new farm bill and putting money in there. There's the supplemental budgets, et cetera. I know that I've heard in the past 24 hours that it looks like the White House is going to be requesting an extra $6 billion for this program. But it's important that this program is not only an important program to get people online where service exists and where the infrastructure is there, but I think it's also actually something that sometimes gets overlooked. It's also a very important program in terms of business models for serving in rural communities. If you are a internet service provider and you are trying to make a business case, but you know that there's a significant chunk of or a sizable part of a community in a rural area, which is already difficult to build in, not just the topography, but just in terms of the sparse population and the high capital cost, you need to be able to rely on, if there's a segment of the population that would get your service but will need ACP, the ACP becomes a fundamentally important part of sustaining the viability of these networks moving forward. And so this is an extremely important program. But as you will probably hear in the digital equity space, if it's not affordable, it's not accessible. And so affordability is a key part of the accessibility question, even where there's service in place. Although we do think it's important to keep in mind that the ACP, and I'll get back to this towards the end here in a few moments, but the ACP is addressing the consequence and not so much the cause in terms of why is internet service so expensive in the first place. Now, these next few slides, I'm just going to go through fairly quickly, which is just to give you a sense of how, I think you've heard about, each, the way the country is sort of set up with 50 states, and each state is sort of this laboratory of democracy. It's very similar as it relates to broadband. Each state, within the bounds of the law, each state are doing something, are doing various things and have various approaches. And in the state of New York, there is the effort there is called the Connect All Initiative. And that is $1 billion office in New York. New York has set aside $1 billion to address broadband connectivity in the region. And one of the interesting things that New York is doing is they've established for municipalities and nonprofits something called the Municipal Infrastructure Program. And these are funds specifically dedicated for municipal broadband projects. That's publicly owned, locally controlled networks. And this is being done in collaboration with the New York Power Authority. And, we heard earlier someone here involved with the Southern Tier Network, which is a middle mile network in the state of New York. And one of the reasons, the primary reason why they set up this municipal infrastructure program is because New York recognizes that it's actually pretty hard to attract private investment and private providers to rural communities because it's difficult to make a business case for capital intensive projects in sparsely populated markets. Now, so far, the municipal infrastructure program is off to real good success. You've got the village of Sherburne, which is in, and I'm not going to pronounce this right, Chenango County, which is in Appalachia, but there's also 3 other towns that have received grant funding from the Connect All initiative, the town of Nichols, Diana, and Pitcairn. Now, in the next slide here is a different approach where in Virginia, maybe I switched the slides around. Can we go to the next slide and then back up? Thank you very much. Oh, Sarah, you're so good. Thank you. So in Virginia is very much leaning heavily on the state's investor-owned utilities and electric cooperatives to bring fiber to rural areas. And so to that end, they've established what they call the Utility Leverage Program. And that is to target bringing fiber into rural parts of the state. And as we get into a more in-depth discussion with Tom, I'm guessing he'll be talking about this as well. But fiber is very much a part of the electric utilities. It's a very important technology in terms of monitoring their electric systems. And so many electric cooperatives have built fiber networks to monitor the SCADA systems and are, overbuilding their networks to extend it to be a fiber to the home network because that's what their members want. Investor-owned utilities, fiber networks are also very important. And the state of Virginia recognized this and said, why don't we work with the utilities and the electric cooperatives to try to extend fiber out into unserved rural parts of the state. Now, for this particular program, it's being administered by the Department of Housing and Community Development in Virginia. They're administering these funds, and folks that are applying for these funds in the state of Virginia, it can be local governments, it can be internet service providers, or it can be utilities themselves. And then already Dominion, one of the big power providers in the state of Virginia, has been working with Surrey County. They've been working with the Prince George Electric Cooperative, the subsidiary of the Prince George Electric Cooperative that is providing fiber internet service. So they are now laying fiber. They've already connected about 7,000 subscribers, but their largest project so far is with the Northern Neck, is in the Northern Neck region of Virginia, where they're deploying hundreds of miles of fiber. They're working with several counties, as you can see here on the slide, and also the Northern Neck Electric Cooperative. The next slide here is an example of how it's not just, again, when we're talking about this, we're talking about not only infrastructure, but digital equity as well. And it's super important that we don't disconnect those two things as if they're separate. They both work hand in hand. Now in Tennessee, they have an interesting digital equity initiative in a program that they call the Broadband Readies Community. And what's interesting to me about this program is that it's a non-competitive program, and where counties and local governments can get up to $100,000 to work on digital equity initiatives in those localities. And what's unique about this program is that it specifically targets low-income communities. And why I think it's interesting that Tennessee made this a non-competitive program, it's, they were like, well, let's not make low-income communities compete against one another. These are resources that every low-income community in Tennessee needs to have access to. And so that's why they structured this program that way. They're right now in the middle. The application window is now open. The deadline ends in a few weeks. By the way, the Tennessee Economic and Community Development Department is also who will be administering the state's BEAD funds. Now, one thing I should point out about Tennessee is that Tennessee, like several states in the Appalachia region, have preemption laws that prohibit municipalities from getting into the broadband business, or prohibit nonprofits from getting into the broadband business. In Tennessee, the law specifically is that only cities with electric utilities can get into broadband. And if they do, they can't offer broadband service beyond their service area. So probably most folks on this call and at this webinar are familiar with the world famous Chattanooga, Tennessee. You know, it's a world-class, one of the best and fastest and affordable fiber networks in the country, Chattanooga. And I look at Chattanooga because it would be wonderful for that to be replicated in other parts of the state, but there is a challenge there with the preemption law, as there are in other states. But in Chattanooga, they've done so well that even without the Affordable Connectivity Program, they are able to offer for all low-income families in Chattanooga or in the Hamilton County School District, which is 17,000 households, they're offering free fiber service for a decade to each one of those households. And it's because they've got different incentives. They've done so well that they're able to do that. So that's a particular community that's probably not as worried about the fate of the Affordable Connectivity Program as a lot of other communities are. And now let me just sort of wrap up here. I don't know if there were questions that popped in, but I just want to wrap up because I know this is a lot of information, and certainly anything that I mentioned, links and resources will be available. But as we close out this funding portion, there's a couple of things that I think are important to take away from this discussion, which is that, as Ms. Manchin mentioned early on, this is truly a once-in-a-generation opportunity to bridge the digital divide once and for all. I didn't coin this term, but I've stolen it and use it quite often. We right now are in the midst of the broadbandification of America, which is very much akin to the electrification of the nation about a century ago. So this is an extremely important moment. The other thing to keep in mind is that unserved locations are the priority areas. That's what's going to get the most focus, and that is actually very good news for the Appalachia region. And as we saw early on in the slides, the scope of the divide is vast. We're talking about, hundreds of thousands, collectively tens of millions of households across the country. But even in the Appalachia region, we're talking about a significant divide. The other thing that again, I can't emphasize enough is that the funding that's out there now, whether it be the BEAD funding or Digital Equity Act funds, there's funding available out there now for infrastructure and digital equity initiatives, which is to say initiatives that address the barriers unrelated to the physical infrastructure. Now, we often get asked at ILSR, so do you think this will be enough? Will everybody be connected? It's one of those questions. Of course, it depends. But overall, I think we can say with pretty good confidence that we should expect that the vast majority of rural areas will be connected probably within, say, the next 3 to 5 years, give or take. And that may sound like a long time, but new networks are not built overnight. There are a lot of challenges and things that go in, it's not about the technology or the engineering, but there are a lot of, permitting and topography and all kinds of things to consider. And so as these networks are being built, we're talking in, say, the next 3 to 5 years. Now, in each of those state 5-year action plans, not every state, but most states answer somewhere in there whether the state itself thinks the funding that they'll get from BEAD will be enough to cover all unserved and underserved locations. Some states say yes, other states say not quite. And then lastly, affordability will continue to be a challenge, which is why, again, the Affordable Connectivity Program is it's so important that we come up with a long-term funding solution. Even if we get this extra $6 billion for ACP, that will kick the can down the road, another, 6 months or so, maybe, at a burn rate of 600 million. We need to come up with a long-term funding solution for the Affordable Connectivity Program, because even in areas where there's networks where for most people the service may be affordable, there will probably always be some segment of the population that will need some form of subsidy to afford internet service. And also, lastly, I'll just say that we also, moving forward, will need to begin to think about more structural solutions to bring competition to the market, which is really at the heart of the affordability crisis. So with that, I will zip it and turn it back over to Sam or Sarah.